Good afternoon and welcome to Community Conversations with Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. We will get started here in just a moment. We're going to give people an opportunity to virtually file in. So just sit tight and we'll be back with you shortly. Okay, welcome to Community Conversations with OCJR. My name is Jacqueline Blocker. We'd like to thank you for sharing a part of your afternoon with us. Today's topic is about court fines and fees. We want to talk about some of the issues, but focus more on some possible solutions. We like to try and offer a little hope to some individuals. So we want to provide education, but also some hope during this holiday season, because we know that fines and fees for those that have been impacted can be a constant burden that's kind of hanging over the heads of our community, people in our community, our neighbors and our loved ones. So this is to offer you a little hope and let you know that advocates continue to work on various issues within the criminal legal system. Before we get started, I would like to introduce our amazing panel. Got some tremendous brain power here with us this afternoon. So first, we have Damion Shade, who is the Criminal Justice Policy Analyst for Oklahoma Policy Institute. Colleen McCarty is the Policy Counsel for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform. Kelly Doyle, who is the Deputy Executive Director for Centers for Employment Opportunities. And Reverend Bill Hemm, who is the Senior Pastor with Forest Park Christian Church in Tulsa. And also with us is the Deputy Director for Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform, Clint Castleberry. Thank you to all of our panelists. And again, thank you to all of our attendees for sharing a little bit of your afternoon with us. If you have any questions for our panelists, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we'll do our very best to get to them during this conversation. So without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Damion Shade, and Damion's going to talk a little bit about the fines and fees issues here and a little bit about best practices in other states and how they're dealing with this issue. So Damion.
Thanks, Jacqueline. I just want to say thank you, and I'm honored to join this remarkable group of Oklahomans to talk about this really important issue. The question of how criminal courts are funded is actually a policy question. It was a deliberate choice by the people we've elected to govern us. So the Oklahoma court system, like many court systems around the United States, is funded predominantly more than 80% by a fee-for-service model, or the way we fund Netflix, right? When you want to watch Netflix, it is funded, it is paid for by the people who use that service, so to speak. So what has happened in the criminal court system is that defendants are the people who are being made to pay for that system. And so kind of the first level of understanding that is understanding the difference between criminal court fines and criminal court fees. So fines are sort of the statutory amount, generally, that you are penalized for the actual criminal offense. In many cases, these are defined in statute, though not always. And in many cases, the range of them has not moved dramatically in the last 30 years. So the best way to look at that would be a speeding ticket. We found that in 1995, a speeding ticket, the fine for a speeding $20 over the speed limit was about $35, the specific fine. Well, you'll say, oh my gosh, I'm sure when people got speeding tickets in the 90s, they weren't paying $30 speeding tickets. And I certainly am not paying a $30 speeding ticket now. So what's happened? And that the thing that has happened is the explosion of fees. And fees is everything else. The easy way to describe fees is fees are all the things that have nothing to do with either your criminal or municipal offense. They can be anything. Just to give you a few examples, there's a law library fee that everyone who gets a speeding ticket in the state of Oklahoma, that's one of the things that you're paying your $200+ on that ticket for. There are cleat fees. Earlier today, I was speaking with some colleagues about a wildlife fee that doesn't show up on your speeding tickets, but shows up on certain criminal prosecutions. And what these fees are to pay for everything that courts do. We found that district courts, that's the courts in all of the state that prosecute crimes, misdemeanors, or felonies, and numerous state agencies rely on the money that come from these fees. Because our lawmakers in Oklahoma have decided not to pay for the court system with taxes, they have to find a way to fill that money in some way. And the mechanism that they've chosen is to have the people who come into the system pay for it. Obviously, this produces a whole array of problems downstream, which I imagine listening to this, the very first thing you would think of is, well, if prosecutors make more money and judges make more money for every person who is prosecuted, and the greater the severity of that prosecution and the duration of that prosecution, or the duration of that sentence, it looks like a pretty perverse incentive. If you make more money, the more people you incarcerate, or the longer you sentence them, you create a situation in which there is effectively a perverse incentive. And it's something that I've heard prosecutors speak about pretty openly, that it does not look good for them to be making money the more people are criminalized. So just on a moral and a pure basic level, the system breaks down there. The other big place that the system breaks down is that we jail people. We actually use what are called failure to pay or cost warrants for people when they have not paid those criminal court fines and fees. So in my city, I'm in Tulsa, Oklahoma. In my city of Tulsa alone, in a handful of zip codes, there are tens of thousands of failure to pay warrants that have been issued since 2010 alone. So these zip codes tend to be places, high density communities of color. The community that was historically known as Black Wall Street, or North Tulsa, the site of the largest act of racial violence in American history, is actually the place with the highest concentration of court debt in Tulsa County. And we actually see that model across the state. In southeastern Oklahoma City, in one of the zip codes that has about an 80% Black population, they have the largest concentration of court debt there. We have found that one of the biggest data proxies for high density communities of color is court debt, outstanding court debt. The per capita court debt in just about a mile and a half north of where I am right now in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in North Tulsa, or that community, the per capita court debt per person in some places is over $500. In that community that's right there, that was known as Greenwood, that historic community, since 2010, we found more than $7 million of just district court debt hanging over that small community of people. We're talking about one of the zip codes has about fewer than 10,000 people, actual residents in it. And that zip code alone had 1 in 5 of the people. Basically, there was 1 case of court debt for every 5 people who live in that zip code. We see a pattern like that across the state of Oklahoma. And so having that court debt makes it harder to keep a driver's license, makes it harder to keep a job, makes it harder to have your criminal record expunged or deferred. Let's say you had a criminal record when you were 19, you struggled with addiction and you ended up in a bad situation. I know people who are, and there are some folks on this call who may speak of their personal experiences as well, who've had experiences where a mistake that they made when they were 19 or 20, they've paid their debt to society, they've gone through the process, now they're 40, let's say 20 years later. And I know people who still have thousands and thousands of dollars of criminal court debt. And they have had to ask themselves really startling questions about that debt. Every month they're supposed to make payments. And one friend of mine actually who's been in this experience said to me, there were so many times speaking to my probation officer where I would literally say, what bills do I not pay so that they won't take me to jail? Do I not pay for my medicine? Do I not pay as much for food for my kids this month? Do I not pay the rent and just hope that we don't get evicted so that way they won't take me back to jail and I won't end up in a terrible situation? These policies are really harmful to people's lives in ways that I think are invisible to most folks looking at the system. And then kind of the last and fairly conservative perceptual thing that I often think about, it doesn't make fiscal sense what we're doing. So from 2012 to 2018, about $900 million of criminal court debt was given to people by courts that was assessed to them. We have collected less than 30% of that debt in that time. That means there's more than $630 million just from 2012 to 2018 hanging over mostly the poorest communities in the state of Oklahoma. In rural Oklahoma, these are truly some of the poorest, lowest life expectancy, highest poverty parts of rural Oklahoma. And then again, in the urban dense communities of color, these are also some of the highest poverty, worst outcome communities that are saddled with essentially a tax, in some cases of tens of millions and across the state of hundreds of millions, and probably if you went back far enough, billions of dollars of criminal court debt that will never be paid, can never be paid. Because again, 80% of most criminal defendants, not just in Oklahoma, but across the nation, are considered indigent or not even able to afford an attorney. So the idea that we would ever be able to fund the court system through them is kind of absurd. And our research at OK Policy has shown that since 2003, there has not been a significant increase in criminal court fee collection. So we've seen since 2014, they appear to have flatlined completely. No matter how many criminal court fees you add, every year they add one over and over and over again like clockwork. But since 24, there's been no statistically significant increase. And since 2003, the proportion that we get of those fees hasn't meaningfully changed. So there's a limit to how much people can ever pay. And we have to, in this conversation, as many of sort of the national best practices pictures have shown us, states and localities should pass legislation to eliminate court-imposed fees that have absolutely nothing to do with criminal offenses. We shouldn't be paying for law libraries or wildlife issues or things having to do with training police officers that have nothing to do with courts. We shouldn't be paying for those things on the backs of the poorest people in our state. Not only is it not a good idea, when you talk about the fact that victim services and drug courts and all sorts of services of the court that actually protect people and perform public safety services are also largely funded by these criminal court fees, meaning they are not adequately funded. So one of the big reasons why Oklahoma has such a deficit in victim services is we do not have the adequate base to actually pay for them. Courts should stop the practice of jailing for failure to pay. It harms rehabilitation, makes absolutely no fiscal sense. And the moral question of whether or not in 2020, in the United States of America, the nation that's sort of be the beacon of democracy to the world, there should be actual debtors' prisons, is something that we should not accept as Americans. Finally, the two other big pieces that will be part of our legislation and our work as a justice coalition here in Oklahoma this year, states should eliminate driver's license suspensions for non-payment of criminal court fines and fees. So if it doesn't have to do with a DUI, if it doesn't have to do with a driving offense, why in the world should you lose your driver's license because you didn't pay the court a bill? Losing that driver's license, by the way, doesn't make it more likely that you will be able to pay the bill to the court. It only makes it more likely that you will lose your job, and more likely that you will not be able to keep your home, and more likely that you will not be able to keep your kids, and more likely that the state will incur massive new costs because of the policy that we chose regarding fines and fees and driver's licenses. So one of the big pieces of hope we have this year is we will be able to end that practice in Oklahoma. And the last piece is that all states should really begin a practice of expunging or purging some of this existing debt. I have no idea how it makes us safer or reduces crime as a state for billions of dollars of criminal court debt to be hanging over literally the poorest communities in our state. I don't know how it makes us safer. I don't know how it makes us wealthier. And I certainly have no sense of how it makes our courts function better, because that $600 million is money that was supposed to be paying for judges and supposed to be paying for prosecutors and paying for victim services and paying for the things that would reduce crime and make our state better. Instead, we've created a system that produces terrible racial disparities and makes the poorest communities in our state worse off and more likely to embrace crime. There is a movement around the country to attack this economic system. And I hope as we go through this conversation, I hope all of our panelists and you'll join us in really becoming passionate about ending this sort of a caste system. Just because you have gotten in trouble with the law does not mean that you should be punished without end. Like Chris Steele likes to say, there's no such thing as a spare Oklahoman, and we shouldn't just destroy someone's financial future because they made a mistake. And certainly we shouldn't be destroying people's financial future because they got a they got a speeding ticket one day and they got a failure to pay warrant because they were never able to pay for it. These things are wrong and they make our state worse. So we can do better. Better policies exist, and we're going to talk about a lot of them today. Thank you all.
Thank you, Damion. That was the perfect way to get this, get this conversation started. And I definitely want to revisit this issue about the zero-sum gain of this fee collection process, because you raised that, and I think that's something that we definitely need to talk about in the discussion portion. So thank you so much for all of that valuable information. I'm going to turn over now to Colleen McCarty, who is going to talk a little bit about the Rule 8 hearing, and hopefully you all learned something new today. So Colleen?
Everybody. So first I just have to do that standard lawyer disclaimer thing where I say nothing that I'm going to tell you today is considered legal advice. So don't go into court and tell people that I told you to do this or that I'm your lawyer, because I'm not, and we ain't doing that. But so Jacqueline asked me to come on the webinar today to talk about a procedure that exists in Oklahoma, a criminal court procedure that allows people to go and request for their fines and fees to be reduced or eliminated. And that procedure is called a Rule 8 hearing. The Rule 8 procedure is laid out in the Oklahoma court procedure. It is the Oklahoma Rule of Criminal Procedure 8.1. And it basically says that when you get sentenced for a crime, the judge has to find out whether or not you can afford the fines and fees that he's about to put onto you as part of your sentence. And if you can't afford them by poverty or by disability, then he has to make that determination under Rule 8, and he has to say that he's not going to levy fines and fees. Now, a study by University of Tulsa students in 2014 found that at least in Tulsa County, during sentencing, that inquiry by the judge does not happen. What they end up doing instead is they give you a form, and the form basically spells out how much money you make, what your income is, what your expenditures are, and what you can afford to pay monthly. They never really actually ask you, can you afford to make these payments? They just sort of say, it's going to be $50 a month, and you sign, this form saying that you will pay that. Most people don't even know that there's an option to say, I can't afford to pay that. They just think this is part of my sentencing, and so I have to do it. So they sign it, and then that gets put in with the cost administrator, and that becomes their sort of payment plan on their fines and fees. Like Damion was saying, there's both criminal fines for the criminal infraction, and then there's additional like line item fees for things like the wildlife conservation fund and the boll weevil eradication fund and things like that none of us have ever heard of or know what they are, but it might not seem like a lot on your court receipt. It might be like $8, but then when you add up, 60 or 70 different line items, it ends up being quite a lot. I talked with somebody the other day who had a criminal sentence that he was still paying off from 2007, and he still owes $53,000 of fines and fees that he's just not sure he'll ever be able to get out from under. So essentially what you would do is you would call the cost administrator at your county where your case is from, and you would go and you would say, I want to ask for a Rule 8 hearing before the judge. And they don't have to do it, so don't get mad at me if they tell you no. They might ask you why you're asking for this hearing or what circumstances have changed. In order to be in a good position to get a Rule 8 hearing, you need to be current with your payments. So if you're behind in your payments and you have a warrant out, this is not a good opportunity for you right now. What you need to do in that situation is you need to pay off any of the back payments that you have. And then you can, after you have a history of good payments, then you can call in and ask for this modification. It's basically a modification of your sentence. And then if you get the Rule 8 hearing, you'll go before the judge and you'll explain, these are the things that have changed in my life that mean I'm not able to pay these anymore. And you want to say, I've paid X number of dollars over X number of years. I've never missed a payment, or if I did miss a payment, I caught it back up. But basically, you can say things like, my hours at my job have changed and I'm not able to make these payments anymore, or I'm seeking to get a pardon, and in order to get a pardon, I have to have all my fines and fees paid, and I want to get this job, and if I don't have a pardon, I can't get this job. They want to hear sort of what's going on in your life that's causing you to be in this situation that you're asking for this reduction, because a lot of judges and prosecutors feel like the fine is a part of your punishment, and they don't feel like they take it lightly to reduce it or eliminate it unless there's good cause. And so you need to be able to show that you have good cause, that things have changed, and that you have been a good sort of student of your fines and fees, that you've paid enough, that you've paid enough off to where you feel like the punishment has, expired. So once you make that explanation, it won't be a very long hearing. It'll just be maybe 5 or 10 minutes of you explaining why you're there, and the judge will make the determination. They can do a number of things. They can reduce the amount of payment per month. So I've seen them reduce it from $50 to $25 a month, or I've seen them reduce the amount, but not totally eliminate the amount, but just reduce it and reduce the payment. But remember, if they're reducing the payment, that simply means you're going to be paying it off for a longer period of time. So reducing the payment is really what they do when they feel like someone's, expenses have gone up and they just need a little bit of a reduction, but they still feel like they can get the payment out of that person. Then they'll reduce it, but they won't eliminate it. I did want to highlight a couple of crimes that have changed recently in Oklahoma law that might have had reductions in fees. The one that I noticed the other day that's the most charged crime in Oklahoma actually is possession with intent to distribute. And when they did a resentencing, they reduced the sentencing on that crime in 2018. And when they did that, they also reduced the fine. So that used to be, I think, $50,000 per count. Now it's reduced to $20,000 per count. So if you have fines and fees that are over the legal amount, you have a good legal basis for asking for a reduction. So the other ones are obviously ones that have been reclassified to misdemeanors, like possession and petty larceny under $1,000, or larceny from larceny from a retailer under $1,000 are other examples where you would have a good case for explaining that, you know, it's been reduced to a misdemeanor. When I committed it, it was a felony. It had a fine structure. It doesn't have that fine structure anymore, so I shouldn't have to pay that amount. Obviously, I would tell you that it's a good idea to talk to a lawyer in this situation, and you need to probably have somebody help you with this plan, but I would not recommend going before the judge in this situation with a lawyer, because you're indicating, this is kind of messed up, but you're indicating to the judge that you can afford to pay somebody. And they're going to say, well, if you can afford to pay a lawyer, why can't you afford to pay off your fines and fees? So you're kind of in a backward situation there where you want to ask a lawyer for help to the extent that they can, but you don't want them to come with you or represent you because you don't want to look like you have the money to pay a lawyer. And that's just the down and dirty Oklahomans for criminal justice reform legal advice that is not legal advice. What else did I want to tell you? It's very, very important that if you are in a position where you feel like you can't make your fines and fees, or that you're making those decisions where you're having, like Damion was talking about, where you're having to choose between paying for groceries or paying for medicine or paying your fines and fees, you can call the court and fines administrators in your county, and you can tell them that I've had a change in circumstances, and they can change your payment plan. I mean, that's not the same as getting a hearing before the judge. They can just do that and reduce your monthly payment. Or they can also give you a reprieve of payment that can go for 1 month, and they can extend it up to 3 months, but it can't go longer than 3 months. So if you're one of those people that is really struggling right now, especially with COVID and everything, I really, really, really recommend that you call the court clerk before things get to the point where you get a warrant put out, because if you get the warrant put out, there's not really anything you can do to recall the warrant other than call in and make the payments. And so I think it's a better situation to be proactive here, even though it can be scary to call them and tell them that you can't make your legal obligations. They do want to know that ahead of time. They don't want you to be in a situation where you get, pulled over and you have warrants out for you. So, I mean, it's one of those situations where we have these very regressive policies that are impacting people so negatively, but we still kind of have to live under this regime and consider, what we can do to make the situation the best that it can be right now before we can make any of these policy changes. And so I know this isn't like the most hopeful portion, but I did want people to just know there is an avenue and some avenues to get relief, and that you are, you're not alone out there. A lot of us are working on this issue and considering how to make this less oppressive and less just draconian, basically, and find progressive ways to fund the courts so that it's not on the backs of the people that can't afford it. I mean, it's literally taking blood from a turnip, or whatever that old saying is. That's what I think of anytime I see somebody struggling with these $53,000, $100,000 fine price tags. It's just like, what are we doing? I mean, and that same person that had $53,000 of fines also was sent to prison and accelerated to a life sentence. So we're saying to somebody, I'm going to send you to prison for life. You won't be able to get a job. You'll never be able to make money. But if you ever do, by any chance, I'm going to take $53,000 of that money from you. It's just double punishment, and it's not necessary. It's almost like we're doing it just for the nominal value of saying that we're doing it, because we know it doesn't work. We know we're not realizing that money, and it costs 50% of the dollars that we say we're collecting. It costs 50% on the dollar to collect them. So it's just really ineffective. And I'm sure we're going to see some movement from the legislature in the coming years on moving us away from this. It's just one of those things where we're so dependent on that money now that we have to figure out how to sort of supplant any money that we stop collecting, right? And so it's going to be a process, but there are a lot of very smart people working on it, and I know we're going to see some movement. So happy to take any questions about the process for Rule 8s or anything like that.
So informative, Colleen. Thank you so much for talking about that. I'm sure a lot of people aren't even aware of the Rule 8 hearing and that being an option. So that's what we're here to do, is to educate people and hopefully, be a catalyst for additional conversations on a going forward basis. So thank you so much for that. And as Colleen said, if you have any questions for our panelists, be sure to drop them in the chat. I'm going to turn it over now to Kelly Doyle, who works with trying to help impact individuals with employment. So Kelly, I would love for you to share your perspective working with your clients and also why you have taken a kind of an interest in this fines and fees.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Jacqueline. Again, my name is Kelly Doyle, and I'm with the Center for Employment Opportunities, or known by many as CEO. We are a transitional work nonprofit. We're national, but we're located in both Tulsa and Oklahoma counties. And every year we're providing an immediate job for immediate pay to about 700 people exiting prisons in Oklahoma and returning to communities. So we provide transitional employment support, and then we help move our participants from working for us into a permanent job, and then continue to provide them some support. So we're very focused on economic mobility of the people that we work with. About 10 years ago, we did a survey of our participants, time flies, to better understand their financial concerns. We did this survey at every CEO office at the time across the country. And it was only in Oklahoma that the number one concern of over 70% of our participants was the fines and fees. It was so starkly different from the other states that CEO operates in that we really wanted to understand more about that. And so we began to do surveys of our participants, and this is by no means science, but we surveyed everyone that was working with us at the time, and they had an average of about $7,000 in criminal court debt. So we made it a priority of us. We knew that we can get someone a job, but really, if you are getting someone a job and they are spending all of their money trying to avoid returning to prison, you're not making a lot of headway on moving someone up the economic ladder. So it's a structural and systemic issue that we've been very focused on in the last few years. So how we've done this is we've kind of looked at it in two ways: one, a programmatic resolution, and one, a policy resolution. So for a programmatic resolution, we just really try to dive in to figure out how we could help alleviate the pressure of these fines and fees on our participants. Our first stop was at District Attorney Kunzweiler's office, where probably about 20% of the people at CEO, and these are people who've been incarcerated, were on DA supervision. DA supervision is you're sentenced to DA supervision, and please, Damion and Colleen, if I'm saying anything wrong, correct me, but you're sentenced to DA supervision, and essentially you pay a fee to the DA's office every month. And I would say that that's the sentence, right? That's the, you're on it for about 2 years. Is that right, Damion? Yep. And it's about $40 a month, which is astronomical for our participants who are coming home from prison and trying to get on their feet. So DA Kunzweiler was gracious enough to work with us, and for the individuals in our program who are under DA supervision who meet certain milestones in our program, he forgives their DA supervision fees. And we've been able, just in the 6-9 months that it's been up and running to forgive about $7,000 in fees. And again, that's just a small percentage of the people who are active in our program. But if they get a job, keep a job at all of these different points, we're able to reduce their fees and then wipe them out completely once they reach the last milestone. You know, it's really a pretty powerful thing to be able to tell someone that they no longer owe this $40. And if I could only recreate, you know, the relief in their faces, if I could only do that, it's a pretty powerful thing to relieve that burden off of people. But, you know, it's a drop in the bucket to the numbers of people that really need that relief. Our second stop was to the Department of Corrections. Department of Corrections takes supervision fees from people who are on probation and parole. And they too waived all of those fees for our participants as they were participating in our program. And so we've been able to, and then lastly, we have a legal aid attorney that works with our participants and takes them to Rule 8 hearings to have what they owe adjusted, what they owe monthly adjusted, not the base that they owe. And our participants, you know, not only is it a relief to them, I would say it connects them to our program. You know, we're able to then begin having conversations often around budgeting. It just opens up conversations for a lot of things. This is, you know, we talk all the time about moving this pilot project to Oklahoma County. It's a lot of work to set up a project like this, only to benefit a handful of people. And so we really need a systemic change. And furthermore, we also don't have enough services to create milestones for people to participate in order to have any relief as well. And so CEO has been very interested in working with stakeholders to find a policy solution. And we're currently the convener of a work group of folks who are looking deeply at this issue and how we can turn around over the next few years. Yeah, that's really all I have to share.
That was tremendous, Kelly. Thank you so much for the work that you and your organization does with impacted people and in the community. And then thank you for taking the interest and recognizing the burden that it has on so many of our community members. And thank you for sharing your experience with us. I really appreciate it. And now, perfect segue over to Reverend Hemm. He has lived experience with this. So Reverend Hemm, why don't you share a little bit about yourself and your story? And thank you again for being with us today.
Sure, of course. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this story and just to be on this panel with all of you wonderful people. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm the pastor at Forest Park Christian Church, which we're at, 91st Domingo in Tulsa. But back in 2012, I pled guilty to a financial crime, a bank-related crime that I did not commit. We don't have time to get into why I did that at this time, but that's important to my story that I did not commit this crime. But so the situations where I had to plead guilty, and so that's what I did. And in the courtroom, when I was there for my sentencing, it was one of the worst days of my life. I'm in this courtroom and we're trying to process all this, and the judge was quite mean to me, but that's fine. And so he's saying all of these things, but then the only soft part of that entire day was when he talked about the fines and the fees that I owed. And I know, Damion, you made a distinction between the fines and the fees. I don't know which one is which, but I had a $10,000 obligation. And so the judge said, you're going to be charged $10,000. Don't worry about that, Mr. Hemm. Once you serve your sentence, it was a 24-month sentence. Once you serve your sentence, get out, then we'll work with you on a payment plan and we'll get you all fixed up and it'll be fine. I go, all right. So I head off to prison while the first month that I'm in prison, talking to my wife on the phone, she said, hey, they're calling me wanting this $10,000. I said, well, they said it was after I got out that they'd messed with it. And so she called the people back and they said, no, that's not the way it works. So we're putting a lien on your house right now for the $10,000. And I know the judge told you we were going to work with you on a payment plan, but we are charging you right now. And if you don't pay within a month, then we're going to pursue action. And I don't know if they would actually foreclose on the house or not, but I mean, they were going to definitely pursue. And so even though the judge told me that they would work with me, they continued to pursue this course of action. So I have affluent family members. And so they all got together. We raised $10,000 in that month and we paid it off. There's so many inmates that cannot do what I just described. There's no way. And I was locked up with lots and lots of wonderful people that did not have affluent family members that could take care of these fines. And so that's how I was able to accomplish my fines and fees, because I had family members that bailed me out. And when I was, and just a brief little story, as I was leaving, I got very close with several of the guys in there. One in particular that was my bunkmate, and he's like family to me. And so he was destitute, and so my family would put money on my books so I could go to commissary and get food and get snacky stuff, and I would always like share. And so when I was leaving, he still had a lot longer to go. And I said, hey, don't worry about it. I'll put money on your books and, you can get to the commissary. And he said, don't put too much because they will take it. And I'm like, well, what's the threshold? He goes, if there's more than $100 in my account, they will start taking it for my fee and my fine. So I had to put $90 every month in his account so that they wouldn't take that and apply to his fee. And so that's been my experience with fines and fees and what they do, and knowing that I was so blessed, if you won't even use that word, to have family members to bail me out, because I couldn't do it. My wife is a teacher. I mean, and so like she couldn't do it either. And so they were hanging that over our head the entire time. And that's kind of my story for that. And I'd love to answer questions and whatnot that you have, but
no,
that's
thank
what
you
happened to me.
so much. That's everything, Reverend Hemm, because you described it perfectly. That burden, that's exactly what it is. It's a burden. I remember speaking with an impacted individual, and she said that like every day just driving, being nervous because if she was unable to afford to make her monthly payment, that's constantly hanging over your head, or as Damion referenced, having to decide between paying this bill or paying your fines or fees to stay out of jail. That is something that too many of the members in our community are dealing with. And like you said, and Damien's noted, the fines and fees are falling on some of our most impoverished individuals. They aren't going to have the resources like you did to have that. So I think it's important for individuals like you to share your stories. So I thank you for being brave enough to do that, because I think that we need people to understand how this is impacting so many people in our community, and the way that we can maybe make some changes. So thank you for that.
Well, and I appreciate it. And, and just think about and knowing that I had these family members that were helping me out, I still couldn't do it myself. I couldn't be there. My wife is crying on the phone. I can't be with my kids. I can't be with my spouse, and I can't make it better. And, it's just an added layer of punishment. So, yeah.
And Reverend Hemm, I hope you don't mind me saying, and I'm not going to get into too much of the detail if you're not comfortable with it, sure. But you accepted the plea because you were being threatened with an excessive sentence. So
That's correct. That's correct. It was a bank bribery thing that I had nothing to do with, but the evidence sure didn't look like that. And so they had threatened 15 years. Where they win, 97% all their cases, all of these scary numbers. They had threatened 15 years or sign on the dotted line and you'll be home in 2. And I can't look at my 3 little girls at that time and go, sorry, daddy's got integrity, can't lie, and I'll see you in 15. That didn't work. So I don't care what I had to say. I had to get back I had to get back home. And so that's why I pled to something I didn't do, because I needed to get back to my family. I was unwilling to roll the dice on 15 years.
You're not alone in that. I think a lot of people accept plea deals because of that threat. And when faced with that choice, it doesn't feel like much of a choice. So
correct. And I had crazy amounts of support with family and with jobs and with, I don't fit into a lot of categories because I had all this support, and it was still the darkest time of my life. And I can't imagine what it's like without that safety net, without that support. And that's 90% of the people I was with.
So true. So true. Thank you so much, Reverend Hemm. I think it's going to be important for individuals to keep sharing their stories. I think it's the narratives and the stories that do affect the change. And so as we all continue to work on this issue, I'm just so appreciative of people that are brave enough to share their stories. And I hope other people will be as brave to come forward as well. We had a question from, I think it's probably to Colleen about, well, I guess anyone who wants to address it, but do courts add interest and pursue collection of the interest on the fines and fees?
I've been trying to research the answer to this while we've been talking. I'm also listening. I can do two things at once. I can't find an answer, but I think the answer is yes. Damion might know better than I do.
So courts don't typically apply interest, but there are cases where collections get involved in the process, and they definitely do. If any sort of private collections process begins, then percentages will be added, and they can be fairly significant and onerous.
And that is what they threatened my wife in my situation. We will be sending you 2 collections at the end of the month if it's not all the way paid.
That's when you really begin to see some of the most perverse things, because once those private actors, it's, they're just trying to get the money. They want the money, and they'll use the threat of our criminal court system, as they did against the Reverend, in that really terrible, immoral way. They'll use those threats to get that money. We've effectively empowered private corporations to use the threat of the police to pay themselves.
There was a lawsuit, Kelly might know more about the Aberdeen lawsuit than I do, but when I was just starting law school, they had just won a class action suit against Aberdeen, who was the private collections agent, at least in Tulsa County, that was, adding exorbitant amounts of interest and doing very abusive collection practices. And they basically said, I'm pretty sure the class action said that they can't use private collections anymore, or at least that they can't do those practices anymore. I know the Aberdeen got pretty much taken out of the system.
Yeah, it was the specific practices in that case, because they're so onerous. And if you looked at that court filing, you would not believe that those practices were actually happening in the United States of America. Like, you would assume it was Saudi Arabia or something, that they were treating people, in these authoritarian ways.
Can you all talk a little bit more about the whole collections process? Because I don't know if, people that are impacted by it understand it, but those who are unfamiliar with it, the fact that it does become a collections issue, and we're almost putting law enforcement in the position of being debt collectors when they're having to issue these failure to pay warrants. So can you all, whomever, to kind of explain how does that process work? How quickly does it kick in? Do they miss 1 month, and can the collection process kick in? Whomever wants to address that.
I think it's different county by county how they determine when a case is ready to go up for collections. Some counties don't ever turn anything over for collections. I know that there was a bill, I think I saw Steve's on here, but there was a bill last session that didn't get very far, that was intended to convert criminal fines and fees over to civil collections processes, which there are obviously reasons why we would not want that to happen, which is, putting a lien on your house, potentially putting in default judgments against people, having the sheriffs come and, take your assets, bankruptcy, that kind of thing could happen if it was a civil forfeiture. But with criminal fines and fees, they can't, as far as I know, they can't levy any of your property or anything. Maybe federally it's different, but in the state, they can't levy your property on criminal fines and fees, but they can pick you up and take your liberty away, right? Because it's part of your punishment for the crime. So that's why when they get you for a failure to pay warrant, they can incarcerate you for a couple of days until the judge can see you and say, let's reset your payment plan. And they'll see you in the morning at arraignment and say, okay, well, why are you here? Oh, failure to pay warrant. And then they'll say, what can you pay today? And they'll say, I don't have any money today. And it's like, well, can you pay by the end of next week? And then once they get an agreement, then they'll let the person go that they've been holding in county, maybe overnight or maybe over the weekend, just based on the fact that they had a failure to pay warrant. And some counties don't put out the failure to pay warrant until it's been a couple of months past. And some of them, it's 1 month past and they get past due on one bill and they put out the failure to pay warrant. It's just like different procedures for different courts and different judges. But at least that's my understanding of how it's very different having to collect a civil debt than it is to collect a criminal debt, which, can be paid for with your liberty. And also, I don't think that they take anything off of your fines and fees for your jail days. I don't think that they do any type of reduction. I did read today that you can ask to do a work program where if you work for an hour, it takes an $8.50 an hour off of your fines and fees owed. And there's no limit on the number of hours you can work. So you could just work as a job to pay off your fines and fees.
Are you describing chattel slavery right now? Is that?
I do believe that.
Is that what's being referenced?
Sounds pretty close. Yeah, so they do allow that in Tulsa County, but I'm not sure about other.
What's the motivation for the court? Because Colleen, you had said that if it's a stronger position if you catch everything up and then go ask for a reduction or something. What's the motivation of the court to reduce that if you're all caught up? Wouldn't the court say, looks like you're having no problem? So, am I looking at that wrong?
It's a difficult balance, but I think you want to get to a position where you've paid enough that they feel like the punishment has been levied. Okay. And you're sort of like weighing this balance. You can go at it another way and say, I've been really struggling to make these payments and I'm behind. But then they're going to leverage on you that you've gotten behind and they can, hold you in county for that. So you don't want to be in a position where you aren't paying, but you also don't want to make it seem like you've got all this money laying around that you can pay your fines, right? Like it's a difficult situation. And most judges and, prosecutors will tell you, they know that people can't pay these fines. They know that it's oppressive and they know that it's not the right way to fund the courts, but they're in this position of feeling like, well, if I don't collect these, the person doesn't get the full sentence that I've handed down. So they kind of have confirmation bias in the process of saying like, I gave this sentence down or one of my colleagues did, and I want it to be executed the way that I put it down. And then you're also in the position of saying, okay, I know this person can't pay this, and I know we'll never realize that full amount. And we also need this money to fund the court. So they want to get to a place where they feel like enough has been realized, like as much has been realized is going to be realized. Basically, we're at the point of no return where this person's paid $600. They served 7 years on a life sentence and got commuted. And is that enough in the judge's mind? And I think usually if somebody has other circumstances going on, like my friend I was talking about before, he's a veteran and he wants to go back to work at Tinker Air Force Base. And so he's going to use that as a basis, right, for saying I need a commutation or I need a pardon so that I can get back to work at Tinker on the airplanes, but I can't get a pardon until all of my fines are paid off. And so it's extenuating circumstances. I am the diamond in the rough that, I can't afford it anymore and I shouldn't have to pay it anymore. And I have this other thing I need to move on to. And if you can kind of appeal to the judge on the right day, then they might, I'm not saying they'll extinguish them completely, but they might bring them down to a point where they can, make it more reasonable.
Thank you so much for that. And that's such a good question, Reverend Hemm, because it is kind of a weird balance to have to strike. Like I can't afford this, but I'm caught up. So I've been paying it, but yeah, it's a delicate balance, but I think it's still important for people to know that that option is available. I want to get to some questions. I think as Kelly, this is for you. Is the CEO Works program in the Moore area of Oklahoma City?
We work for Moore. So we have actually a contract with the city of Moore. We've been working with the city of Moore since we launched in Oklahoma City in 2013. After the May 2013 tornadoes, we began partnering with the city of Moore to clean up after the tornado, rehang street signs, and our relationship with them has continued. So you might see our vans and you might see our people in Moore, but our services are being provided to people in Oklahoma County, which is not Moore.
That is amazing. Thank you. Well, we have 5 minutes left. I would like to go around and have everyone, this has been an amazing discussion. And for those who are unable to watch it live, please let them know that it will be posted on the OCJR. Recording of this and all previous webinars are posted on the OCJR Facebook page. But I'm going to go around to all of our panelists, and if everyone would just take about 30 seconds or a minute or so and kind of closing statements, closing thoughts, call to actions, just whatever you would like to share with the folks before we close this out. Damion, you want to start off?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you to Oklahomans for Criminal Justice Reform and Jacqueline and everyone here on the call for the opportunity to talk about this issue today. Taxing the poorest communities in the state to fund the court system is terrible policy. It doesn't reduce crime, and it effectively paints a law enforcement target on all of these communities that cannot bear the cost of these policies. And so there's no good reason to do this. It makes our courts worse. It probably increases crime to some extent, and it creates the type of just terrifying moral quandaries that the Reverend had to deal with his family. That's just an unthinkable situation. How does an unthinkable situation like that make us more safe? Is always the question that I would hope our policymakers and that people on this listening to this call would ask. The last thing I'd say is there's been so much research in the last decade really confirming that this system makes police and all of our law enforcement structures function less well. So one study showed that there's a county in New Mexico that spends $1.17 to collect every dollar of court fines and fees that they get. Think about that. They're spending more money in cops, the amount of time that they spend to send cops out to go pick people up because they're poor and they can't pay their fees, than they ever get back. And while those cops and while those sheriffs are chasing people down for court debt, they're not chasing serious crimes. They're not dealing with serious offenses. They're not responding to 911 calls. They're literally acting as collections agents. I hope that this is an issue that can kind of unite us all against that idea.
I'll go ahead and go. I would, from a service provider perspective, I would say that, our job is to help people stabilize and support themselves so that they don't go back to prison. And we know that their economic security is a big reason why some might go back. And so our job is made much more difficult by these fines and fees. And I think, I can speak, I think, on behalf of all of our participants when I say they truly want to pay their fines and fees. They don't want to go back. And lack of doing so is not willful. They're just really strapped, especially right when they come out of the system and have, need a first month's rent, need to begin to contribute to their family, and are far less likely to be given a job by an employer now that they have a conviction. And so this is just not a sustainable way for us to support our court systems. I don't think the courts like it. I don't think the district attorneys like it. And so I think it would be a really good thing for our state to concentrate on how we're going to supplant that money and fund our courts, not on the backs of the people who are poor and in it.
And I long for the day that we look up and finally say, I think excessive punishment is not working. I mean, as a United States citizen, as an Oklahoman, I long for that day when we go, let's try something else. I'm not saying we eliminate the punishment system, but excessive punishments are the reason that we're in the state that we're in. And so I wish that more people would be aware and of the implications of everything that goes into our justice system.
Colleen?
I think that it's important to remember that injustice comes in all shapes and sizes, and that this is not a sexy issue. I mean, we're talking about line items on a state budget. It's real boring, but it has a huge impact, and it's not letting someone out of prison. It's not going back and getting your win at the Supreme Court, but it is an integral and important part of everyday reality for people who are justice involved. And that's where the dirty work is. That's where we're being called to create change. And I think even though it's not sexy, it's important. And so I hope that we can get more people engaged in talking to their senators, talking to their state representatives, emailing the governor, whatever we have to do to get more awareness raised around this issue. I think OK Policy has done such a great job of illuminating the policy concerns around this problem. And now it's up to us to really push forward a change that works. And we need to be able to trust our leaders and our senators and our representatives to take on this issue and take it off of our backs. It's just so complicated and so rife with so many issues. It's like we need to be able to have leaders we can trust to manage this problem. So thanks everybody. It's been a really good conversation.
Thank you all so much. I think this has been so amazing, so much valuable information. Colleen makes a great point about this. Get informed, contact your lawmakers, be informed about who the leaders are, who your DAs are, like who are the people that are doing this, and let's work together to solve this problem and find a better way to fund our court system and to make it more effective. Because the zero-sum gain and the way that we're doing it now just is not working. So it's time for us to keep trying something different. I thank our panelists for all your tremendous work that you're doing on this issue and other things in the community. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you for all of our participants. And again, if you missed this, if someone that wanted to watch it and missed it, please let them know there will be a recording up later this week on the OCJR Facebook page. Thank you all again for spending part of your afternoon with us, and we look forward to the next conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jacqueline.
Thank you.
Take care.